Welcome. Tonight we are exploring the complete history of the Irish Gaelic kingdoms, from the granite coronation stone that supposedly shrieked when the rightful king touched it, to the 73-year-old monarch assassinated in his tent by a fleeing mercenary on Good Friday. This is the story of a fractured land bound together by blood, cattle, and poetry, where powerful families waged centuries of war for a single throne. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. Now, settle in, soften your shoulders, slow your breathing. Let's begin. The year is 400 CE. The location is the island of Hibernia. Morning dew coats the green blades of grass on a sloping hillside. At the top of this hill stands a ring fort. Builders constructed this circular settlement by digging a deep exterior trench. They piled the excavated soil into a raised inner bank. They stacked grey limestone blocks against the earthen bank to prevent erosion. A palisade of sharpened oak logs sits on top of this bank. Men felled mature oak trees with iron axes and split the trunks into heavy wooden posts. They drove the flat ends of these posts deep into the soil. The oak logs stand 8 feet tall and create a solid perimeter. Inside this defensive circle, 50 people live in round houses. Builders construct these houses by driving hazel poles into the earth and weaving flexible willow branches between them. They coat this wooden frame with a thick layer of mud and animal hair. The morning air sits at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind smells of wet clay and wood smoke rising from a central fire pit. Herdsmen walk through the muddy courtyard of the ring fort. They hold smooth ash wood staffs in their hands. They use these staffs to guide a herd of brown and black cattle out of a central wooden enclosure. The cattle walk through the main gate and head down the hillside toward the open pastures. In this society, cattle function as the primary unit of currency. The Gaelic inhabitants operate a localized agricultural barter economy. They trade cows to acquire iron tools, bronze dress pins, and glass beads. The cattle also provide daily calories. Women milk the cows each morning and curdle the liquid into hard yellow cheese. Men slaughter the older animals to harvest beef. Tanners scrape the cowhides with iron blades and soak the skins in water and tree bark to produce durable leather for shoes and belts. A family measures their total wealth by counting the physical number of cattle they lock inside their ring fort at night. 50 miles to the east, the salty waters of the Irish Sea crash against the coastline. This body of water separates Hibernia from the neighboring island of Britain. The Roman Empire controls the British landmass. Roman engineers build straight paved roads using layers of crushed stone and gravel. Roman soldiers garrison inside rectangular stone forts. Roman administrators mint silver and gold coins to regulate commerce. The Roman military halted their westward construction at the British shoreline. The Gaelic people of Hibernia developed their civilization entirely through their own localized tribal structures. They organized their society based on extended kinship ties and geographic proximity. The island contains roughly 150 independent petty kingdoms. The Gaels call these individual territories tuatha. A single tuath encompasses a specific geographic area measuring roughly 10 to 20 square miles. Natural landmarks like winding riverbeds, dense oak forests, and steep mountain ridges define the borders of each tuath. The inhabitants also carve vertical lines into standing stones to mark territorial boundaries. Masons use iron chisels to cut a series of horizontal and diagonal notches along the vertical edge of a rectangular stone pillar. Each specific grouping of notches represents a distinct letter in an alphabet called ogham. The carvings spell out the names of local rulers and their ancestors. A single localized king rules the population living within the borders of a tuath. The Gaels call this king a Ri. The size and shape of these 150 tuatha change continuously. The Ri leads armed bands of men across the boundary lines to attack neighboring kingdoms. These raiding parties march on foot through the damp river valleys. The warriors carry iron-tipped thrusting spears and round wooden shields. They stretch raw cowhide over their wooden shields and let it dry to form a hardened outer layer. The men fight in hand-to-hand combat to secure access to superior resources. They battle over control of freshwater springs, dense timber patches, and thicker grasslands needed to feed their growing cattle herds. A victorious Ri forcibly absorbs the defeated tuath into his own holdings. He demands the surviving inhabitants hand over their cattle as a tribute payment. This continuous cycle of warfare causes the exact number of independent kingdoms to fluctuate with each passing harvest season. The people living within these shifting political borders share a uniform legal system. A specialized class of highly educated men manages this complex legal framework. These legal scholars carry the title of brehons. The brehons memorize thousands of specific customary laws. These laws govern property ownership, physical injury, marriage contracts, and social hierarchy. The brehons pass this legal knowledge to younger students through oral recitation. The students sit and repeat the legal verses aloud until they commit the exact phrasing to memory. When a physical conflict or property dispute arises within a tuath, the local inhabitants summon a brehon. The brehon sits on a wooden stool and listens to witness testimony from both sides. He calculates exact compensation values using the standardized currency of cattle. The brehon determines the precise number of female cows required to compensate a family for a stolen horse, a burned house, or a broken arm. The law assigns a specific numeric honor price to every person in the society, from a common herdsman to a king. The brehon calculates this specific value, called an eric. He orders the perpetrator's family to hand the required cattle to the victim's family. If the perpetrator lacks the necessary cows, his extended kin group pays the debt on his behalf. This oral legal code remains identical across all the independent kingdoms on the island. A brehon traveling from the southern limestone valleys to the northern coastal cliffs applies the exact same rulings to local disputes. The continuous warfare forces the smaller tuatha to seek military protection. The localized kings form political alliances to defend their herds. A lesser Ri travels to the stronghold of a more powerful neighbor. He pledges his military support and hands over a portion of his cattle wealth. In exchange, the stronger king commits to defending the weaker king's territory from outside attacks. These pledges of submission create a structured political hierarchy. The individual tufa cluster together into expansive regional territories, forming large provincial overkingdoms. The local rulers of the 150 petty kingdoms pledge their military support to 5 prime overkings. The inhabitants organize the island into 5 expansive regional territories. They call these overarching territories Cois Sida. The spoken Irish word cuige translates directly into the English word fifth. The geographic borders divide the landmass into exactly 5 distinct provinces. The overkingdom of Ulaid covers the rocky northern coastlines and deep glacial valleys. Men in Ulaid row timber-framed, hide-covered currachs into the freezing Atlantic waters. They drop woven nets overboard to catch cod and herring, pulling the heavy, thrashing fish into the boats. The over-kingdom of Connacht spans the western limestone plains. Herdsmen drive sheep across the cracked limestone pavement to graze on the short grasses growing in the stone fissures. They shear the sheep with iron snips, gathering the raw white wool into heavy canvas sacks. The over-kingdom of Leyhin occupies the southeastern river basins and granite mountains. Farmers in Leyhin plant oats and barley in the dark, fertile soil along the riverbanks. They harvest the ripe stalks in late August using curved iron sickles, binding the grain into tight sheaves to dry in the sun. The over-kingdom of Mumhan encompasses the southern fertile pastures and deep natural harbors. Traders anchor wooden ships in these southern harbors. They carry heavy wooden barrels of wine, imported from the European continent, down wooden gangplanks, exchanging the alcohol for raw copper ingots mined from the local mountains. The fifth over-kingdom of Midé sits in the exact geographic center of the island, bordering the other 4 territories. The men and women living in these 5 provinces gather at regional outdoor assemblies. The Gaels refer to a regional assembly as an oenach. Local kings select specific, elevated hilltops and wide river bends to host these gatherings. The assemblies occur during the dry summer months and the harvest seasons in early autumn. Families travel on foot and in wooden horse-drawn carts for up to 20 miles to reach the designated assembly sites. Carpenters construct the cartwheels by bending steamed ash wood into a continuous circle and securing it with an iron rim. The horses pull the heavy wooden carts over packed dirt trails, kicking up dry dust into the summer air. The families arrive at the assembly carrying woven willow baskets filled with surplus grain, dyed wool cloaks, and iron farm tools. Merchants lay these physical goods out on tanned animal hides spread over the short grass. Buyers inspect the iron sickles and exchange their surplus butter and barley to acquire the metal goods. Women display large woolen cloaks, dyed bright red, using the crushed roots of the madder plant. The thick wool smells of lanolin and sheep sweat. Fathers negotiate marriage contracts for their sons and daughters while standing in the crowded fields. They agree on the specific number of cattle required for the dowry payment and shake hands to finalize the agreement. The brehons sit on flat limestone boulders at the edge of the assembly field. These legal scholars listen to oral testimony from rival families regarding property lines and stolen livestock. They issue binding judgments based on their memorized legal verses, ordering the guilty party to transfer a specific number of cows to the victim. Young men run foot races across measured dirt tracks, sweating and breathing heavily to win the competition. Riders mount bareback on native Connemara ponies and race the animals in a wide circle around the perimeter of the camp. The horses dig their hooves into the soft turf, throwing clods of damp earth behind them as they sprint. The winning runners and riders receive bronze arm rings from the local king. Blacksmiths cast these arm rings by pouring molten bronze into 2-piece clay molds. The overkings from the 5 prime provinces organize larger assemblies to secure tribute payments from the lesser Tuatha. The highest of these regional gatherings occurs in the central kingdom of Midé. The provincial rulers and their armed retinues travel to an elevated ridge known as the Hill of Tara. This specific assembly happens once every 3 years. The gathering coincides with the Celtic New Year festival called Samhain. Samhain marks the end of the agricultural harvest and the beginning of the winter season. The festival begins precisely on the first day of November. The air temperature drops to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind carries the smell of dying oak leaves and frost-hardened soil. The Gaels refer to this specific 3-year gathering at Tara as a feast. The attendees construct temporary shelters by bending hazel branches and covering them with woven woolen blankets and raw animal hides. Hundreds of campfires burn simultaneously across the sloping green hillside, releasing thick plumes of grey smoke and the scent of roasting meat into the autumn air. Men slaughter older cattle with iron axes and pack the beef in sea salt to preserve the meat for the coming winter months. Kings, brehons, and merchants sleep in these temporary camps for exactly 7 consecutive nights. During the daylight hours, the Overking of Maid presides over the feast. He sits on a raised earthen mound, constructed by manual labourers using iron shovels and wicker baskets. The subordinate kings walk up the grassy incline and present him with physical tribute payments. They hand over iron swords, gold neck rings, and ropes tethered to young calves. The Overking accepts these items and distributes wooden drinking horns filled with fermented honey mead to the compliant rulers. The subordinate kings drink the sweet, alcoholic liquid. Accepting the drinking horn functions as a physical acknowledgement of formal submission to the Overking. The brehons document these agreements by carving the names of the submitting kings into square wooden staves using the intersecting lines of the Ogham alphabet. The Hill of Tara serves as the primary location for these political transactions and large-scale gatherings. The site contains dozens of circular earthen banks, deep defensive ditches, and raised burial mounds spread across a wide grassy plateau in modern-day County Meath. The inhabitants of the island utilized this specific ridge for thousands of years prior to the arrival of the Gaels. Stone Age laborers dragged massive limestone slabs up the hillside to construct underground passage tombs long before the iron-wielding kings claimed the territory. The Hill of Tara sits in modern-day County Meath. The site consists of a low limestone ridge rising 500 feet above sea level. The ridge provides a direct line of sight stretching for 20 miles across the flat central plains. In the year 3000 BCE, Stone Age laborers construct a passage tomb on the highest point of the ridge. They dig into the topsoil using the discarded antlers of red deer as handheld picks. They scoop the loose dirt away, using the broad, flat shoulder blades of dead cattle. The workers transport limestone boulders, weighing up to 3 tons across the grassy plateau. They arrange these heavy stones to form a short, narrow tunnel, leading into a central burial chamber. They roof the stone chamber with overlapping flat rock slabs, employing a technique called corbelling to distribute the heavy weight of the stones. They cover the entire stone structure with layers of heavy clay and loose gravel, forming a hemispherical mound measuring 50 feet in diameter. The interior chamber measures exactly 13 feet in length, and the air inside sits at a constant temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling of damp soil and cold limestone. The builders align the entrance of the passage tomb to face the rising sun on the specific mornings of early November and early February. The light from the rising sun travels down the narrow stone passageway and illuminates the back wall of the chamber. This specific stone structure carries the modern name of the Mound of the Hostages. The builders place cremated human remains inside the central chamber. They use crushed charcoal and burning oak branches to cremate the bodies at temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. They carry the grey ash and bone fragments into the dark stone tunnel and deposit them on the flat stone floor. By the year 2000 BCE, Bronze Age inhabitants utilize this exact same hilltop as an elite graveyard. They dig shallow circular pits into the compacted soil of the hill. They lower whole human bodies into these newly excavated graves. Metalworkers smelt raw copper ore in small clay crucibles heated over charcoal fires. They use animal skin bellows to pump oxygen into the fire, raising the temperature to 1984 degrees Fahrenheit to melt the copper. They pour the liquid metal into carved two-piece stone molds to produce flat, triangular copper daggers. Mourners place these finished copper daggers next to the bodies in the graves. Goldsmiths extract raw gold nuggets from the riverbeds in the Wicklow Mountains to the south. They hammer the gold nuggets into thin, crescent-shaped collars called lunulae, using smooth river stones. They engrave the flat gold surfaces with geometric triangles and straight intersecting lines, using sharpened bronze awls. Mourners lay these engraved gold collars across the collarbones of the deceased inside the earthen graves. The labourers shovel the loose dirt back over the bodies, burying the metal objects under a thick layer of topsoil. Centuries later, the Gaelic kings arrive at the hill of Tara to claim the high ground for their own political centre. They construct massive earthworks across the ridge. Labourers dig a deep circular trench measuring 3,000 feet in circumference. The Gaels call this specific enclosure Rath na Riach, translating to the Fort of the Kings. Inside this wide circular boundary, they build two smaller adjoining ring forts. They pile the excavated dirt into high banks and reinforce the slopes with wooden posts. To the north of the main enclosure, builders dig two parallel earthen banks stretching exactly 750 feet in length. The Gaels call this linear earthwork Teach Mio Chuata, translating to the banqueting hall. The parallel banks stand 90 feet apart, forming a long, open-air corridor running straight down the slope of the hill. Travelers walking up the northern slope pass directly between these two high earthen walls to reach the summit. The kings select a standing granite pillar on the southern end of the ridge to serve as an inauguration stone. The Gaels call this stone the Leophile. The grey granite pillar stands exactly 5 feet tall above the grass. The stone features a rounded top and a textured, abrasive surface. A king undergoing inauguration stands beside the stone on the day of his coronation. He places his bare foot flat against the side of the granite pillar. The wind blows across the open ridge at 20 miles per hour, carrying the scent of trampled grass and sheep dung from the surrounding pastures. The assembled crowds of minor kings and local tradesmen watch the physical coronation process from the edges of the earthen banks. Monastic scribes living in the later medieval period write down the oral traditions surrounding this specific physical act. They manufacture writing materials inside scriptoriums built from stone and timber. The monks soak calf skins in vats of quicklime and water to remove the animal hair. They stretch the wet skins tightly across wooden frames to dry, scraping the surfaces smooth with crescent-shaped iron knives to create vellum pages. They boil crushed oak galls, iron sulfate, and tree sap in iron pots to produce a dark, permanent ink. The monks dip shaved goose feather quills into the iron gall ink to record the mythology onto the prepared vellum pages. The scribes write that the granite stone at Tara shrieked aloud when the rightful monarch placed his foot against it. They record this event using the Latin alphabet, writing neat, uniform letters in straight horizontal lines across the page. The scribes write that the shrieking sound echoed across the grassy plateau, signaling the transfer of political power to the new ruler. The monks bind these vellum pages between thick wooden boards covered in leather, preserving the physical description of the inauguration ceremony for future generations. The newly inaugurated king steps away from the granite stone and walks down the grassy incline of the hill. He immediately turns his attention to securing his new political position among his subjects and rivals. The royal family relies on a highly specific method to choose this incoming ruler from a wide pool of eligible male relatives. The newly chosen king must immediately prove his physical strength by marching his armed followers across the territorial borders to seize the neighboring herds of cattle. Gaelic royal families determine political succession through an elective system called tanistry. The extended family group, known as a Derbfine, controls the selection of the next ruler. The Derbfine spans exactly 4 distinct generations. The group includes a man, his sons, his grandsons, and his great-grandsons. All male members of this 4-generation kinship group share equal legal standing to claim the kingship. The eligible men gather inside a wooden ring fort to conduct the selection process. They sit on split log benches and vote to select the next ruler from their own ranks. The men base their selection on the physical strength, chronological age, and accumulated cattle wealth of the candidates. The chosen successor receives the formal title of Tarnist. The family selects the Tarniste, while the current king remains alive and active on the throne. This deliberate overlap secures the immediate transfer of political authority upon the eventual death of the ruling monarch. Upon the death of the reigning king, the Tarnastes assumes command of the Tuath. The newly inaugurated king immediately organizes a military expedition called a Cresh Ririg. The spoken phrase translates directly to a royal prey. The king gathers 50 armed men wearing dyed wool tunics and leather shoes. They march across the territorial boundary lines at dawn, walking through wet grass at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. They enter a neighboring kingdom to locate the grazing pastures of a rival monarch. The armed men shout and strike their round wooden shields with iron spear shafts to startle the grazing animals. They use long ashwood staffs to drive hundreds of stolen cows back across the border into their own territory. The mature cows weigh up to 800 pounds each, crushing the wet ferns and heather under their split hooves. The men force the animals to swim across cold, fast-moving rivers to evade pursuing forces. The successful theft of cattle physically demonstrates the new king's military capacity to his subordinates. He distributes these stolen cows to his most loyal warriors to guarantee their ongoing military service. Cattle operate as the primary currency of the entire Gaelic economy. The inhabitants utilize a standard dairy cow, called a set, as the base unit of value for all economic transactions. Traders exchange one set for exactly 1 ounce of mined silver or a highly trained hunting dog. The cows provide daily sustenance for the rural population. Women draw warm milk from the udders into wooden buckets each morning. They pour the milk into tall wooden barrels and agitate the liquid with a wooden plunger to churn it into butter. The inhabitants pack this churned butter into carved wooden vessels called methers to create long-term food storage. A mether consists of a single piece of hollowed willow wood fitted with a separate flat lid. Men carry these heavy containers into the local wetlands and bury them 3 feet deep in the wet, black peat. The acidic water in the bog features a pH level of 4. Sphagnum moss grows in thick mats across the surface of the bog, physically blocking oxygen from reaching the buried containers. This wet anaerobic environment halts bacterial decay, preserving the high-fat dairy product for years. The buried butter gradually absorbs the earthy smell of the surrounding decaying plant matter. Butchers slaughter the aging cows with heavy iron axes and remove the hides using sharp iron knives. Tanners soak the heavy hides in large wooden vats filled with water and crushed oak bark. The tannins in the oak bark chemically alter the animal's skin to produce cured leather. Craftsmen cut the cured leather with iron shears to stitch shoes, belts, and rigid scabbards for their iron swords. In the middle of the 6th century, a ruler named Diarmait mac Serbail assumes the kingship of Tara. Diarmait directs the continuous military expansion of the southern Uí dynasty across the central plains of Mead. The kingship of Tara requires immense physical resources to maintain. Diarmait extracts tribute payments of cattle and iron from dozens of lesser kings across the region. He summons these subordinate kings to the Hill of Tara to witness his formal inauguration ceremony, known as the Fis Temro. The spoken phrase translates to the Feast of Tara. This specific ceremony functions as a literal marriage between the king and the pagan goddess of the land. The men slaughter pigs and cattle to feed the assembled crowds on the grassy plateau. They roast the meat on iron spits, suspended over open oak fires. The animal fat drips directly into the orange coals, sending thick grey smoke drifting across the limestone ridge. The king drinks fermented barley ale from a carved wooden cup handed to him by a designated priestess. The dark alcohol contains local honey and wild yeast, smelling of roasted grain and pine resin. Diarmait physically sleeps inside a designated wooden structure on the Hill of Tara, alongside the priestess, to finalize the marriage rite. The completion of this fertility ritual ensures the subsequent growth of barley crops and the reproduction of the cattle herds according to local pagan belief. Historical texts document Diarmait as the final king of Tara to sponsor this specific pagan marriage ceremony. During the middle of the 6th century, a newly introduced religious infrastructure spreads across the Irish landscape. Pope Celestine I previously dispatched a bishop named Palladius to the island in the year 431. Palladius and subsequent missionaries construct small wooden chapels using split oak logs. Men wearing unbleached wool habits carry wooden crosses and vellum books into the rural valleys. Foreign bishops from the European continent introduce Latin texts and a monotheistic theology to the Gaelic population. Local men begin wearing the tonsure, shaving the front half of their heads from ear to ear. These men build small stone churches adjacent to the ancient pagan assembly sites. They organize their new religious communities around autonomous rural monasteries, fundamentally altering the physical and cultural geography of the entire island. In the year 431 CE, Pope Celestine I sits in a stone basilica in Rome. He dictates a letter in Latin to a scribe. The Pope dispatches a bishop named Palladius to the island of Hibernia. Palladius travels across the European continent, riding on horseback over paved Roman roads. He boards a wooden ship and sails across the choppy waters of the Irish Sea. He arrives on the eastern coast of Hibernia to minister to a small, existing population of Gaels, currently practicing Christianity. Palladius carries wooden crosses and Latin Gospels bound in stiff calfskin leather. He directs local laborers to construct small timber churches using split oak logs along the river valleys of the eastern coastline. In the later 5th century, a Roman-British bishop named Patrick arrives on the exact same coastline. Decades earlier, Gaelic raiders captured Patrick from his family estate in Britain and forced him to herd sheep on a mountain in Hibernia for 6 years. Patrick escaped on a ship, studied theology in Europe, and returned to Hibernia as an ordained bishop. He walks through the northern Tuatha, wearing a rough, unbleached woolen tunic. He speaks the Gaelic language directly to the local kings and rural herdsmen. Patrick pours cold river water over the heads of the inhabitants to perform baptism rituals. He appoints local men to serve as priests and builds clay-walled chapels near the existing earthen ring forts. Patrick introduces mainstream Latin Christianity across the entire agricultural landscape. The local inhabitants gather inside the timber churches on Sunday mornings to listen to priests recite Latin prayers from vellum pages. The imported Roman church structure requires urban cities and centralized dioceses to function. The Gaelic landscape consists entirely of dispersed rural settlements. The church adapts to this specific agricultural geography by constructing autonomous rural monasteries. Monks wearing undyed wool habits build thick circular stone walls to enclose these new religious settlements. They stack flat slate rocks to build small, beehive-shaped stone huts called clochans. The builders use a corbelling technique, layering the flat stones slightly inward until they meet at a central point at the roof. The monks sleep inside these unheated stone huts on beds of dry straw. They wake before dawn, when the air temperature sits at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They walk across the wet grass to a central timber church to sing psalms in unison. A local abbot governs each monastery independently, operating separate from the authority of any regional bishop. The abbot manages the surrounding farmland and the cattle herds donated by local kings. Monks work in the fields using iron spades to turn the dark soil. They plant oats and barley during the spring months. In the autumn, they harvest the grain with iron sickles. They pour the harvested oats between two heavy circular millstones called a rotary quern. A monk turns a wooden handle inserted into the top stone, grinding the oats into coarse flour. The monastery operates as a completely self-sufficient economic unit, producing its own food, leather, and metal tools. The monks construct dedicated wooden buildings called scriptoriums to house their literary work. They introduce the complete Latin alphabet to the Gaelic population. Prior to this introduction, the Gaels carved straight ogham lines into stone to record short names. Inside the scriptorium, scribes sit on wooden benches to manufacture writing materials. They soak calf skins in vats of quicklime and water to loosen the hair. They stretch the wet skins tightly across wooden frames to dry. The monks scrape the stretched skins smooth with crescent-shaped iron knives, called lunellums, to create thin, pale vellum pages. The scribes use sharpened goose-feather quills to write curved Latin letters onto the cured vellum. They copy Christian Gospels, Roman historical texts, and mathematical tables calculating the date of Easter. They also listen to the local brehons recite customary laws and ancient mythology. The scribes translate these spoken Gaelic words into written text, preserving the oral culture in permanent ink. They boil crushed oak galls and iron sulfate in iron pots to produce this dark black ink. The monks paint complex geometric patterns and the shapes of elongated local animals around the capital letters. They crush red lead to make orange pigment and grind lapis lazuli, imported from the Middle East, to produce deep blue colors. By the 6th century, these rural monasteries operate as large schools. Students travel on foot from the European continent to study Latin grammar and astronomy inside the Irish scriptoriums. In the year 563 CE, an abbot named Columba leaves his monastery in the northern province of Ulaid. He boards a curragh built from bent ash wood and tightly stretched cowhide. 12 other monks join him in the boat. They row across the freezing waters of the North Channel and land on Iona, a small rocky island off the western coast of Scotland. Columba builds a new monastery on Iona using timber and turf. From this island base, Columba and his monks walk across the Scottish Highlands to convert the Pictish tribes. In the year 590 CE, Another Irish monk named Columbanus walks south into the European continent. He establishes new monasteries at Luxeuil in modern-day France and Bobbio in Italy. These traveling monks carry illuminated manuscripts and silver chalices wrapped in leather satchels on their backs. They introduce literacy and organized education to regions of Europe experiencing the total collapse of Roman administration. Back on the island of Hibernia, the physical wealth and grain surpluses of the monasteries attract the attention of powerful local dynasties. The Gaelic kings donate land to the abbots and extract political loyalty in return. A specific royal family dominates the northern half of the island and heavily influences these new religious centers. This family traces its lineage directly back to a single powerful king who ruled from the hill of Tara. This specific king accumulated his initial political power by launching aggressive sea raids against the neighboring island of Britain, forcing captives onto his wooden ships long before the first Christian bishops arrived on the eastern shore. In the late 4th century, a ruler named Niall commands the central political assembly at the hill of Tara. The inhabitants of the island call him Niall Noigi-Elach. This title translates directly to Niall of the Nine Hostages. Niall organizes continuous military campaigns from his earthwork fortresses in the Midlands. He expands his political authority by launching maritime raids across the Irish Sea. Niall directs local shipwrights to construct large wooden vessels on the eastern beaches. The laborers fell mature oak trees using heavy iron axes with ash wood handles. They split the dense oak trunks into long, flat planks using iron wedges and heavy wooden mallets. The carpenters overlap the edges of the wooden planks to form the outer hull. They secure the planks together using iron rivets. The metal workers heat the iron rivets in charcoal fires until the metal turns bright orange. They push the hot rivets through the overlapping wood and hammer the metal flat against the interior surface. The workers heat sticky pine resin and animal fat in iron cauldrons. They press the black tar into the seams between the overlapping oak planks using flat wooden spatulas. This physical barrier prevents the ocean water from leaking into the hull. The crew pushes the heavy oak ships down the gravel beaches and into the salt water of the Irish Sea. 50 men sit on wooden benches inside each ship. They pull long ashwood oars through the cold, grey water. The ocean temperature sits at 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the early spring. The men row eastward across the channel, breathing in the smell of salt spray, wet timber, and damp wool cloaks. They navigate the ships toward the western coastlines of Britain and the northern shores of the European continent, a region known as Gaul. Niall and his men land their ships on the sandy beaches of these foreign territories. They march inland, carrying iron-tipped thrusting spears and round wooden shields covered in hardened cowhide. The raiding parties extract physical wealth from the local stone settlements. They load heavy silver plates, raw copper ingots, and woolen textiles into the hulls of their oak ships. They also extract human captives from the ruling families of these foreign territories. Niall specifically captures the sons and daughters of rival kings and regional chieftains. He secures these high-status captives with forged iron collars around their necks. Blacksmiths attach short iron chains to these collars, linking the captives together in a single line to control their physical movements on the wooden boats. The Gaelic raiders transport these chained captives back across the Irish Sea to the province of Meath. Niall utilizes these captives as political hostages. In the customary legal system managed by the Brehons, taking a human hostage physically guarantees the political submission of a rival leader. A foreign king refuses to send his armed warriors to attack Tara, while Niall holds his children inside the earthen ring forts. The hostages live inside the circular wooden houses within the king's enclosure. They eat roasted beef and wear bright red woolen clothing, but armed guards holding spears stand at the wooden gates to block their departure. Historical records state Niall successfully held 9 high-status hostages simultaneously. He extracted 5 hostages from the rival provinces on the island of Hibernia and 4 hostages from the foreign kingdoms of Britain and Gaul. Niall establishes a massive family lineage during his reign at Tara. He fathers 7 documented sons with multiple women. One of his primary sons carries the name Eogan. These 7 sons grow into adulthood and lead their own military forces across the northern and central landscapes. The descendants of these 7 sons adopt a specific family name to identify their shared bloodline. They call themselves the Uí Néill. This Irish phrase translates directly to the grandsons of Niall. This specific royal family subsequently dominates the northern half of the island for the next 6 centuries. Modern geneticists physically track the expansion of this specific family lineage through biological evidence. Researchers collect saliva samples from thousands of modern men living across the island. The scientists rub sterile cotton swabs against the inside of the men's cheeks to collect loose skin cells. They place the cotton swabs into clear plastic vials and transport them to sterile laboratories. The laboratories maintain a constant air temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit and smell of chemical alcohol. The scientists extract the microscopic DNA molecules from the collected skin cells using liquid solvents and automated spinning centrifuges. The geneticists analyze the physical structure of the Y chromosome under high-powered microscopes. Fathers pass the Y chromosome directly to their biological sons during reproduction. The scientists identify a specific genetic mutation on this chromosome. They classify this specific mutation as haplogroup RM222. The laboratory computers count the frequency of this exact genetic marker among the tested population. The data reveals that 21% of all modern males living in the northwest region of the island carry this specific haplogroup in their cells. The researchers map the geographic distribution of these genetic results on paper charts. They mark the highest concentrations of the RM222 mutation using red ink. The red ink clusters heavily across the northwestern counties of Donegal and Tyrone. The scientists compare this modern genetic map to the historical boundary lines of the ancient Tuatha. The densest concentrations of the specific Y chromosome mutation correlate directly with the historical stone forts and earthen enclosures controlled by the Uí Néill lineages. The biological descendants of Niall reproduce continuously over 15 centuries, leaving a permanent genetic signature across the physical population of the region. The immediate sons of Niall physically divide this growing family into 2 distinct factions to manage their expanding territories. They separate into the northern Uí Néill and the southern Uí Néill. The brothers gather their armed retainers and their large cattle herds. They march away from the hill of Tara in opposite directions to establish new regional capitals. The northern branch marches into the steep, rocky hills of County Donegal to claim a massive stone ring fort standing 800 feet above sea level. The northern Uí Néill march into modern-day County Donegal and climb a steep hill rising 800 feet above sea level. They claim a massive stone ring fort known as the Grianan of Ailach. The fort sits exactly on the geographic peak between 2 deep saltwater inlets, Lough Swilly and Lough Foyle. Labourers build the circular defensive wall using dry stone masonry techniques. They stack grey schist rocks directly on top of each other, relying on gravity and precise stone placement to hold the structure together. The main circular wall measures exactly 77 feet in internal diameter. The stone barrier stands 16 feet high and reaches 15 feet in thickness at the base. Builders construct 3 internal stone terraces stepping up the inside of the wall. Armed men climb these stone steps to stand on the upper platforms, looking down over the sloping green hillsides. The wind blows off the Atlantic Ocean at 30 miles per hour, bringing the scent of salt and crushed heather to the men standing on the walls. The northern Uí Néill claim the formal title of the Kings of Gaelic. The descendants of Niall's son Eogan form a specific kindred group called the Senil Neogain. They march their armed forces east from Gaelic into the neighboring territory of Gaela. The warriors wear knee-length linen tunics and carry ashwood spears tipped with forged iron heads. They attack the local rulers and seize control of the fertile river valleys in modern-day County Tyrone. The geographic name Tyrone originates from the Gaelic phrase Tír Eogan, translating directly to the land of Eogan. They herd captured cattle back to their stone enclosures, increasing their physical wealth. Another group of descendants forms the Senil Conail, securing the western coastal regions of Donegal. These two factions breed thousands of cattle on the hillsides and arm their retainers with iron swords. The southern Uí Néill travel south and east to secure the agricultural midlands. They establish their dominant presence in the Kingdom of Meath, encompassing modern-day County Meath and County Westmeath. Farmers cultivate the dark soil using heavy wooden ploughs fitted with iron coulters. They yoke pairs of castrated male oxen to the ploughs using leather harnesses. The animals drag the iron blades through the earth, turning over straight furrows of soil. The southern Uí Néill kings extract tribute payments from these farmers in the form of barley grain and woven wool. They physically occupy the hill of Tara, claiming the ancient inauguration stone and the surrounding earthworks. They force the smaller Tuatha to hand over hostages, securing political control over the central plains. The geographic separation between the northern and southern branches creates 2 distinct centers of political power. The leaders of both branches develop an alternating system to share the kingship of Tara. A king from the northern Uí Néill travels south to the hill of Tara to claim the kingship for his lifetime. Upon his physical death, the title transfers to a king from the southern Uí Néill. The southern king rules until his death, passing the title back to a newly selected northern leader. This physical rotation of power continues for several centuries. The kings travel between the northern stone forts and the southern earthen enclosures on horseback, followed by retinues of brehons, poets, and armed guards riding native Irish draft horses. In the year 637, the King of Ulster, Congal Caic, raises an army to challenge the Uí Néill. Congal gathers thousands of men from the northeastern coastlines. A northern Uí Néill king named Domnall Macéda leads the opposing forces. Domnall belongs to the Senil Conail branch and holds the alternating title of King of Tara. Domnall marches his army east to meet the Ulster forces. The two armies converge at a flat agricultural field known as Mag Roth in modern-day County Down. The battle occurs during the summer months. The air temperature sits at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and the men sweat under the weight of their woolen cloaks and heavy leather belts. The soldiers form tight horizontal lines across the dirt field. They hold circular wooden shields constructed from overlapping alder planks and grip the iron shield bosses. The opposing lines run forward and crash into each other. Men thrust iron-tipped spears over the tops of the shields, targeting the unprotected necks and faces of their enemies. The iron blades slice through skin and muscle, spilling warm blood onto the dry soil. Domhnall's forces push the Ulster army backward across the field. They break the enemy formations, causing the Ulster soldiers to drop their shields and run. Domhnall's warriors chase the fleeing men and strike them in the back with iron swords. Congal Cach falls dead on the battlefield from a direct spear thrust. The physical death of the Ulster king at Magroth eliminates the largest regional military threat to the Uí Néill. Domhnall Mac Ida secures complete political supremacy over the northern half of the island. Following the battle, the local Tuatha send hundreds of cattle to Domhnall's enclosures as a formal demonstration of submission. Monks sitting in the rural scriptoriums record the events of the battle onto vellum pages. The scribes dip their goose-feather quills into iron gall ink and write the specific date of 637. They write the name Domhnall Mac Adair next to the Latin phrase Rex Hiberniae, translating directly to the King of Ireland. The monks bind these vellum pages between wooden covers, preserving the physical record. The Uí Néill lineages dominate the northern half of the island, a geographic zone the Gaels label Leth Quin. 200 miles to the south, a rival royal dynasty establishes absolute control over the southern half of the island, known as Leth Moga. This southern dynasty marches their forces to a massive limestone outcrop rising sharply from the flat plains of County Tipperary. They build a new political centre on the elevated rock, preparing to accumulate their own immense wealth through the fertile pastures of Munster. 200 miles south of the Hill of Tara, the Oganachta dynasty asserts control over the southern half of the island. The Gaels label this southern territory Leth Moga. The Eoganachta rulers march their forces to a massive limestone outcrop in modern-day County Tipperary. Geologists classify this geologic formation as the Rock of Cashel. The rock rises precisely 200 feet above the surrounding flat agricultural plains. The summit measures approximately 2 acres in total area. The limestone features steep, vertical cliffs on 3 sides. Labourers climb the sloping southern approach, carrying iron pickaxes and woven willow baskets. They dig into the topsoil to establish a secure foundation for a new stone fortress. Builders quarry flat limestone blocks from the nearby hills using iron wedges and heavy wooden mallets. They transport the heavy stones on horse-drawn wooden carts. Masons stack the limestone blocks to form a continuous circular perimeter wall around the flat summit. The wind constantly blows across the exposed rock at 25 miles per hour, carrying the scent of crushed grass and wood smoke from the valley below. The Eoganachta kings rule over the province of Munster from this elevated stone fortress. The surrounding flatland contains deep, mineral-rich soil. Farmers call this specific region the Golden Vale. The air temperature in southern Munster averages 50 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year. The warm Gulf Stream ocean current passes along the southern coastline, warming the air and preventing winter frost from freezing the soil. This specific climate allows thick ryegrass and white clover to grow continuously for 12 months. Herdsmen graze cattle outdoors throughout the winter without needing to harvest and store dried hay. The cows consume the wet grass and produce high yields of milk. The continuous grazing cycle generates massive agricultural surpluses for the local population. The Cashel kings trade this surplus with merchants sailing wooden ships from the European continent. The merchants anchor their ships in the deep natural harbours of the southern coast. They roll heavy wooden barrels filled with red wine down timber gangplanks. The Cashel kings exchange cattle and raw copper ingots for the alcohol and small leather pouches of sea salt. They also extract silver coins minted in Gaul as a direct tax on the coastal trade. Silversmiths melt these foreign coins in clay crucibles heated over charcoal fires. They pour the liquid silver into carved stone molds to cast heavy silver arm rings. The kings of Cashel convert this accumulated physical wealth into political power. They maintain political stability by exploiting their geographic distance from the northern battlefields. The Slieve Bloom Mountains and the wide bogs of the central Midlands create a physical barrier separating Munster from the Uí Néill territories. The Óganacht kings focus their resources on consolidating local power rather than marching armies across the muddy central bogs. They utilize a specific economic system to secure the loyalty of the lesser Tuatha inside Munster. A king of Cashel distributes physical goods to the smaller regional rulers. The Brehons call this legal system of distribution Rath. The king of Cashel gathers native Irish draft horses bred in the coastal wetlands. These horses stand 14 hands high at the shoulder and feature thick, waterproof winter coats. Men train the horses to carry armed riders by guiding them with leather bridles and forged iron bits. The Cashel king stockpiles iron swords forged by local blacksmiths. The blacksmiths heat raw iron ore in clay furnaces reaching 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. They hammer the glowing hot iron on flat stone anvils to draw out 30-inch double-edged blades. They cut a shallow central groove down the middle of the blade to reduce the total weight of the weapon. They wrap the wooden hilts in cured calf leather and secure the grips with copper pins. The Óganacht king presents these specific horses and iron weapons as gifts to a neighboring regional king. The neighboring king accepts the horses and swords by taking them directly from the hands of the Cashel ruler. This physical transfer of goods establishes a binding legal contract between the two men. The lesser king formally acknowledges his status as a subordinate vassal by accepting the physical items. He immediately incurs a legal debt to the king of Cashel. The lesser king repays this debt by sending a designated number of armed men to fight in the Cashel army during the summer raiding season. He also sends annual tribute payments to the Rock of Cashel. The Gaels call this mandatory tribute payment cane. Herdsmen drive hundreds of brown cattle up the steep limestone path and hand them over to the Óganacht guards. They also herd fat pigs with coarse black hair up the incline. Women carry woven willow baskets filled with dyed red wool and hardened yellow cheese. The Cashel guards store the cheese and wool inside circular wooden storehouses built directly on the limestone bedrock. The Óganacht dynasty integrates religious authority directly into their secular rule. Several kings of Cashel simultaneously hold the title of Christian bishop or abbot. These men wear dyed woolen cloaks fastened with bronze pins over white linen clerical tunics. They carry iron swords on their leather belts alongside curved wooden croziers. The king bishop celebrates Latin Mass inside a timber church constructed on the Rock of Cashel. He drinks wine from a silver chalice and distributes flat wheat bread to the congregation. After completing the religious ritual, he steps outside into the muddy courtyard to organize a military raid. He commands men to sharpen their iron spearheads using flat sandstone whetstones. He presides over physical legal assemblies on the grassy summit. Scribes sit on wooden benches inside the fortress and record the legal judgments onto vellum pages. The scribes write down the exact number of cattle paid in tribute and the specific names of the vassal kings. They dip their goose feather quills into iron gall ink to update the regional property records. The scribes also copy imported Latin texts detailing the political structure of the Roman Empire. They read historical accounts describing a single emperor ruling over a massive unified territory. The monks apply this specific political concept to the geography of Hibernia. They begin writing new genealogies for the powerful Gaelic dynasties across the island. The scribes sitting in the rural monasteries invent a historical narrative featuring a continuous line of supreme monarchs. They compile extensive lists tracing these central kings back thousands of years. They create this literary framework to legitimize the contemporary political ambitions of the regional rulers striving to dominate the entire island. In the late 7th century, monastic scribes invent a specific political title and record it in their Latin texts. The monks write the words Ard Ri, translating directly to the High King of Ireland. Scribes working in scriptoriums allied with the Uí Néill dynasty compile extensive genealogical records onto thin vellum pages. They document a continuous line of central monarchs ruling the entire island from the Hill of Tara. The scribes stretch this written timeline backward by thousands of years. They record specific names and dates for kings who lived during the Bronze Age, connecting their contemporary Uí Néill patrons directly to the ancient builders of the earthen ring forts. A scribe working in the late 7th century writes a specific poem called the Baile Chuind. The monk dips a sharpened goose-feather quill into ink made from crushed oak galls and iron sulfate. The poem details a vision experienced by a historical ruler named Conn of the 100 Battles. The written text lists the specific future kings who will succeed Conn at the Hill of Tara. The Uí Néill kings use these written documents to demand tribute from neighboring provinces. They transport the bound vellum manuscripts to regional assemblies during the summer months. The scribes stand on flat limestone boulders and read the genealogies aloud to the gathered crowds. The Uí Néill kings enforce these written political claims through direct military action. They march armies of men wearing leather armor across the central bogs to extract cattle from the western kingdoms. A provincial king extracts tribute strictly from the tuatha physically adjacent to his own borders. He maintains a standing force of 50 armed men carrying iron-tipped spears to enforce his local taxation. The local rulers retain direct control over their own Brechin courts and internal property divisions. The High King receives annual payments of silver and cattle from these local rulers. The regional kings send herds of brown cows walking across the dirt roads to the Hill of Tara. The High King distributes these cows to his own warriors to maintain their military loyalty. In the 8th century, scribes continue to expand the High King genealogies. They bind the vellum pages between thick wooden boards covered in cured calfskin. They store these heavy books inside the stone churches, placing them inside carved wooden chests to protect the animal skin pages from the damp climate. The air inside the churches remains at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling of beeswax candles and wet stone. The Uí Néill kings finance the construction of large stone crosses outside these rural churches. Masons extract massive sandstone blocks from local quarries using iron chisels and wooden mallets. They carve the sandstone blocks into freestanding crosses measuring 15 feet in height. The craftsmen carve complex geometric knots and biblical scenes directly into the surface of the stone using sharp iron awls. The carvings depict men carrying iron swords and riding horses. The kings stand beside these towering stone crosses to issue legal judgments, using the physical monuments to mark their outdoor courts. The human population of the island grows during this specific period of localized rule. Farmers clear dense oak forests using heavy iron axes to create new grazing pastures for their expanding cattle herds. They pile the fallen timber and burn the wood, sending thick grey smoke into the sky. They plant oats and barley in the newly cleared soil, harvesting the mature grain in late August with curved iron sickles. The surplus grain feeds the expanding armies of the regional kings. The regional kings build new ring forts using earth and timber to protect these agricultural surpluses. Laborers dig deep circular trenches around the settlements and fill the perimeters with sharpened wooden stakes. The kings concentrate their physical wealth inside these fortified enclosures. They store silver arm rings, bronze dress pins, and colored glass beads in leather pouches. The monks living in the nearby monasteries also accumulate vast physical wealth. Metal workers, employed by the abbots, craft silver chalices decorated with gold filigree wire and colored glass studs. They place these valuable metal items on wooden altars inside the timber churches. The monks also stockpile surplus grain and salted beef to feed the traveling students studying in their scriptoriums. The geographic location of these specific monasteries leaves them physically exposed on the coastal edges of the island. Monks living on Rathlin Island off the northern coast wake up on a specific morning in the year 795. The air temperature sits at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind blows salt spray across the rocky beach. The monks look out across the grey, freezing water of the North Channel. They see long, shallow-draft wooden ships approaching the shoreline. The ships carry armed men from the Scandinavian peninsula. These men hold iron broadaxes with 30-inch wooden handles. They steer their wooden ships directly onto the gravel beach, seeking the silver chalices and human captives stored inside the stone churches. In the year 795, Scandinavian men arrive on the gravel beaches of Rathlin Island. They sail shallow-draft longships across the North Channel. Shipwrights construct these vessels using overlapping oak planks secured with iron rivets. The builders smear heated pine pitch between the oak planks to waterproof the hull. The ships draw exactly 3 feet of water, allowing the crews to row directly onto the sloping shorelines. The men step onto the wet gravel, wearing thick wool cloaks and carrying iron broadaxes. They walk up the grassy hill to the stone monastery. The raiders strike the wooden doors with their axes, splitting the ash-wood panels. They enter the stone churches and remove silver chalices, gold-plated reliquaries, and leather-bound vellum books. The men capture the local monks and tie their wrists with hemp ropes. They force the bound captives onto the wooden ships and row back into the freezing ocean. During the 9th century, fleets of these oak longships navigate the inland waterways of the island. The Scandinavian crews lower their square-woven wool sails and row up the River Shannon. They move hundreds of miles deep into the central Midlands. The shallow drafts of the ships allow the men to bypass the rocky coastlines and land directly on the muddy riverbanks adjacent to unprotected agricultural settlements. The raiders disembark and march into the earthen ring forts. They seize surplus grain, salted beef, and local inhabitants. The Scandinavian crews load the stolen goods and human captives into the hulls of their ships. They transport the captives across the open ocean to foreign slave markets in Scandinavia and the Iberian Peninsula. Traders exchange the enslaved Gaelic people for Islamic silver dirhams, Byzantine silk textiles, and glass beads. By the middle of the 9th century, the raiding parties establish permanent winter camps on the island. In the year 841, Scandinavian crews construct a fortified naval encampment on the southern bank of the River Liffey. The Gaels call this specific type of coastal fortification a long fort. Labourers dig a deep D-shaped trench in the coastal mud. They pile the excavated dirt to build a high protective bank facing the land. They drive sharpened ash timber stakes into the top of the earthen bank to form a continuous palisade. The men pull their wooden ships completely out of the water and drag them behind the timber walls for the winter months. The air temperature drops to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The men light large charcoal fires inside the enclosure to stay warm. They build similar timber and earth long forts at the mouths of the River Suir, the River Slaney, and the River Shannon. These fortified coastal encampments expand into dense urban centres. The encampment on the River Liffey becomes the city of Dublin. The settlements on the southern and western rivers become Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick. Inside these new cities, carpenters lay down thick oak planks over the wet mud to create formal street grids. Builders construct rectangular houses closely packed together along the wooden streets. They drive ashwood poles into the ground and weave flexible hazel branches between them to form the walls. They pack wet clay mixed with animal dung over the woven branches to block the cold ocean wind. Thousands of inhabitants live continuously inside these specific city boundaries. The high population density generates a constant smell of burning peat, raw sewage from open cesspits, and salted fish hanging on wooden drying racks. The Norse settlers introduced standardized metal currency to the local agricultural economy. The Scandinavian merchants bring cast silver coins minted in foreign cities. Metal workers inside the Irish long forts cut large silver arm rings into smaller fragments using iron chisels. The merchants use balanced bronze scales to weigh these silver fragments, called hacksilver, calculating exact payments for traded goods. In the late 10th century, the kings of Dublin begin minting their own silver pennies. They stamp the flat silver discs with their own facial profiles and names. Artisans set up permanent workshops inside the wooden houses. Craftsmen carve red deer antlers into double-sided hair combs. Blacksmiths forge iron ship rivets, iron knives, and iron keys for wooden locks. The urban centers operate as mass manufacturing hubs, exporting these physical goods to the surrounding rural Tuatha. The inhabitants of the coastal cities initiate direct social contact with the surrounding Gaelic population. The Scandinavian men arrange formal marriage contracts with the daughters of neighboring Gaelic kings. These specific unions produce a new hybrid population. The scribes living in the monasteries classify this new generation as the Gáil Goidil, translating to the foreign Gaels. The children of these marriages grow up speaking both the Old Norse and the Gaelic languages. The Norse Gaelic men adopt the Gaelic system of tanistry to select their urban kings. The local Gaelic warriors acquire Scandinavian iron broadaxes and incorporate the heavy cutting weapons into their own battle formations. Gaelic kings hire Norse Gaelic mercenary fleets to attack rival provinces along the coastline, paying the crews with silver pennies and stolen cattle. The Norse Gaelic city of Limerick sits at the mouth of the River Shannon in the southern province of Munster. The urban kings of Limerick send fleets of wooden ships up the river to extract silver and cattle from the local Tuatha. These continuous military raids deplete the physical wealth and political authority of the ruling Eoganachta dynasty stationed at the Rock of Cashel. A lesser Gaelic dynasty living in modern-day County Clare observes this shift in regional power. The Gaels call this family the Dal Cais. This specific family controls the strategic river crossings along the Shannon. The men of the Dal Cais gather their iron weapons and march out of their earthen ring forts to confront the fleets sailing up the river. In the early 10th century, The Norse Gaelic men, living in the coastal city of Limerick, sail oak longships up the River Shannon. The ships measure exactly 50 feet in length and draw 3 feet of water, navigating directly over the shallow mudbanks of the estuary. The Limerick crews drop heavy stone anchors into the riverbed and walk ashore onto the grassy riverbanks. The armed men attack the earthen ring forts built by the local Gaelic families. The Scandinavian raiders carry heavy iron broadaxes and strike the wooden palisades, splintering the oak logs. The raiders capture hundreds of brown cattle and transport the animals back to their urban markets on the coast. The Scandinavian butchers slaughter the stolen cattle using heavy iron cleavers, selling the beef in the crowded wooden streets of Limerick. The ruling Eoganachta dynasty remains inside their elevated limestone fortress at Cashel, 50 miles to the east. The continuous loss of physical wealth severs the legal bonds of obligation between the Cashel kings and the lesser regional rulers. A distinct Gaelic family lives in modern-day County Clare, on the western bank of the River Shannon. The Brehons record their family name as the Dalkaises. The Dalkais territory features exposed limestone pavements, deep caves, and dense hazel scrub. Geologists classify this specific landscape as the Burren Karst region. The Dalkais family controls the physical crossing points of the River Shannon near the modern town of Killaloe. They station armed guards at the shallow river fords, where the water measures exactly 2 feet deep during the dry summer months. Men carrying 30-inch iron swords and round wooden shields collect silver fragments and cattle from traveling merchants crossing the water. A man named Senetig mac Lorcain assumes the kingship of the Dal Case in the year 934. He issues legal decrees from his primary earthen ring fort at Kincora. Senetig organizes the local farmers into a standing military force. He mandates that men train with iron-tipped ash spears in the flat agricultural fields. Senetig leads these men into direct combat against the Limerick fleets navigating the river. The Dal Case warriors hide in the thick hazel bushes along the muddy riverbanks. They wait for the Norse Gaelic ships to enter the narrow channels of the river. The Gaelic men throw heavy limestone rocks and iron javelins directly into the wooden boats. The projectiles strike the Scandinavian rowers and crack the overlapping oak planks of the hulls. Senetig captures the silver coins and raw metal ingots stored inside the damaged Viking ships. He transports this captured silver in leather sacks to local blacksmiths operating within the Dal Case ring forts. The metalworkers melt the silver coins in small clay crucibles heated over charcoal fires. The air temperature near the furnaces reaches 1,760 degrees Fahrenheit. The metalworkers pour the liquid silver into carved stone molds to create heavy, circular arm rings. Senetig distributes these silver arm rings to his most successful warriors, physically securing their ongoing military loyalty. Senetig marches his expanding army east out of County Clare. The men walk across the flat agricultural plains of the Munster province. They attack the traditional Tuatha, allied with the Eoganachta dynasty. The Dal Case warriors cut down the oak palisades of the rival ring forts using heavy iron axes with 30-inch wooden handles. They burn the thatched roofs of the circular houses, sending thick black smoke into the sky. They capture herds of dairy cows and drive them back across the River Shannon. Senetig dies in the year 951. His eldest son, Mathgamain mac Senetig, immediately claims the kingship of the Dal Case. Mathgamain continues his father's territorial expansion across the southern province. In the year 964, Mathgamain marches his armed forces to the Rock of Cashel. The limestone outcrop rises 200 feet above the surrounding pastureland. The defending Eoganachta forces stand behind the circular stone walls on the summit. Mathgamain's men climb the steep southern approach path, carrying woven willow shields to block incoming stones. They use heavy timber logs, measuring 20 feet in length, to strike the wooden gates of the fortress. The oak gates splinter and collapse onto the dirt. The Dal Case warriors enter the courtyard and strike the Eoganachta defenders with iron swords. The blood of the defenders pools on the flat limestone bedrock. Mathgamain stands in the center of the captured stone fortress and declares himself the King of Munster. The regional Brehons record this specific transfer of power in their vellum manuscripts using iron gall ink. Mathgamain forces the surviving Eoganachta kings to hand over their male children as hostages. Blacksmiths heat iron bars in charcoal fires and bend the glowing metal to forge heavy collars. They place these iron collars around the necks of the captured sons. Mathgamain locks these hostages inside wooden storehouses to guarantee the physical submission of their fathers. Mathgamain rules from the Rock of Cashel for exactly 12 years. He collects mandatory tribute payments from the surrounding Tuatha. Herdsmen drive thousands of cattle up the limestone hill to satisfy the annual tax requirements. The displaced Eoganachta leaders arrange a political meeting with Mathgamain in the year 976. Mathgamain travels to a designated ring fort in modern-day County Cork to negotiate a peace settlement. He travels with exactly 20 armed bodyguards, leaving his main army stationed at Cashel. The Eoganachta men surround Mathgamain in the muddy courtyard of the ring fort. They thrust iron spearheads into the chests and stomachs of Mathgamain and his bodyguards. Mathgamain bleeds to death on the dirt floor of the ring fort at the age of 50. The Eoganachta leaders immediately send messengers on horseback to reclaim the surrounding Tuatha. The messengers ride native Irish ponies across the rocky terrain, covering 30 miles a day. News of the assassination reaches the Dal Case territory in County Clare 3 days later. Mathgamain's younger brother, Brian Boru, receives the information while standing inside an earthen ring fort. Brian Boru stands 35 years old and carries a custom iron sword forged in the Limerick workshops. He immediately assumes total command of the Dal Case military forces. He orders his commanders to gather the men and sharpen their iron weapons on flat sandstone whetstones. Brian Boru mounts a native draft horse and rides out of the wooden gates to initiate a massive retaliatory campaign against the rival factions of the southern province. Brian Boru rides his native draft horse out of the earthen ring fort in the year 976. He leads the Dal Case army south toward the Eoganachta territories to retaliate against the men who assassinated his older brother. The soldiers wear knee-length linen tunics and carry 30-inch iron swords. They march over the wet limestone pavements of the Burren, moving exactly 20 miles per day. Brian targets the rival regional leaders directly responsible for his brother's death. His soldiers strike the wooden gates of the enemy ring forts using heavy ash logs. They seize the rival chieftains and execute them in the muddy courtyards using iron broadaxes. Brian marches his forces out of the agricultural plains and approaches the coastal city of Limerick. The Norse Gaelic inhabitants of Limerick live inside dense grids of wooden houses, surrounded by a high earthen bank. Brian orders his infantry to surround the city walls, physically blocking the supply of grain and beef into the urban centre. The Norse Gaelic king of Limerick, a man named Ivar, surrenders the city to Brian Boru. Ivar walks out of the wooden gates and hands over leather sacks filled with minted silver pennies and raw silver arm rings. Brian distributes this captured silver to his own warriors to secure their continuous military loyalty. Brian constructs a dedicated naval fleet to control the inland waterways of the island. He commands local carpenters to fell mature oak trees along the banks of the River Shannon. The shipwrights split the massive oak trunks into thin, flat planks, using iron wedges and wooden mallets. They build 50 shallow-draft wooden ships, utilizing overlapping clinker construction. Blacksmiths heat raw iron in charcoal forges and hammer the metal into sharp rivets. The carpenters drive these hot iron rivets through the overlapping oak planks to secure the hulls. They boil pine pitch in iron cauldrons and smear the black, sticky tar into the seams to waterproof the vessels. Brian loads his armed infantry into these wooden ships. The rowers pull long ashwood oars through the cold river water. The fleet travels north along the River Shannon, bypassing the thick mud of the central bogs. The Dalkais forces navigate the waterways into the province of Connacht. The men step out of the ships onto the muddy riverbanks and walk directly into the agricultural fields. They capture hundreds of brown dairy cows and herd them onto the wooden vessels. Brian uses this rapid amphibious military strategy to extract mandatory tribute from the northern and western Tuatha. The Uwinail dynasty controls the central kingdom of Midi during this expansion. The reigning Uwinail king, Máel Sechnaill mac Domhnail, holds the formal title of High King of Ireland. In the year 1002, Brian Boru marches his army and sails his fleet simultaneously to the town of Athlone. Athlone sits in the exact geographic center of the island, on the banks of the River Shannon. The air temperature stands at 55 degrees Fahrenheit on the day of their meeting, smelling of damp soil and horse sweat. Máel Sechnaill rides a horse into the Dalkais encampment alongside a retinue of armed guards. He brings 50 high-status hostages tethered together by thick hemp ropes. Máel Sechnaill physically hands the ends of these ropes to Brian Boru. This specific physical transfer of human hostages formally surrenders the title of High King to Brian. This single event terminates exactly 600 years of Uwinail monopoly over the supreme political title on the island. Brian Boru secures the High Kingship for his southern Munster dynasty. Brian returns to the southern province holding the highest political office on the island. He diverts a massive portion of his newly acquired cattle wealth to reconstruct the rural monasteries previously damaged by Viking raids. Laborers travel to the monastic sites and dig new foundation trenches in the dark soil. Masons cut flat limestone blocks using iron chisels. They mix quicklime and river sand to create wet mortar, spreading the paste between the limestone blocks. They build tall, circular stone towers measuring up to 100 feet in height. These towers feature a single elevated wooden doorway, facing east, toward the rising sun. Carpenters chop mature ash trees to build new timber roofs for the damaged stone churches. Brian travels north to the monastic settlement at Armagh in the province of Ulster in the year 1005. He walks into the central stone church and places exactly 20 ounces of raw gold directly onto the stone altar. A local scribe records Brian's physical visit inside a bound vellum manuscript called the Book of Armagh. This specific book contains the complete Latin text of the New Testament. The scribe dips a goose feather quill into black iron gall ink. He writes the Latin phrase, Imperator Scotorum, translating directly to the Emperor of the Gaels, next to Brian's written name. Brian mandates a new administrative system to organize the collection of tribute across his newly expanded territory. He orders the regional brehons to assign permanent hereditary surnames to all local landowning families. Prior to this decree, Families tracked their lineages strictly through the oral recitation of their ancestors' individual first names. The scribes begin writing specific prefixes in front of the names of powerful men. They write the letters MAC to designate a son. They write the letter O to designate a grandson. This new written naming convention directly links a specific family line to their exact physical property boundaries and cattle herds. The scribes record the annual taxation owed by each newly named family onto vellum rolls. Tax collectors travel across the provinces carrying these written documents in leather satchels. They read the names aloud and demand the exact number of cows listed in the ink records. The King of Leinster, a man named Mal Morda, receives one of these tax demands in the year 1013. Mal Morda rules the eastern coastal province, controlling the fertile agricultural valleys of the Wicklow Mountains. He retains his cattle inside his own wooden enclosures and rejects the tax demands. Mal Morda formally breaks his legal bonds with the High King and initiates an armed rebellion. He mounts a native Irish horse and rides north to the Norse Gaelic city of Dublin. He meets with the King of Dublin, a Norse Gaelic leader named Sigtryg Silkbeard. Mal Morda negotiates a direct military alliance with Sigtryg to fight the High King's army. Sigtryg immediately dispatches wooden longships across the Irish Sea to recruit heavily armed Viking mercenaries from foreign islands to reinforce the Leinster rebellion. King Sigtryg Silkbeard dispatches wooden longships from the port of Dublin across the Irish Sea. The crews sail to the Orkney Islands and the Isle of Man to recruit mercenary soldiers. A Viking commander named Brodir accepts the payment of minted silver pennies in the Isle of Man. Brodir commands a fleet of 20 longships built from overlapping oak planks. Another Scandinavian commander named Sigurd the Stout sails south from the Orkney Islands with hundreds of armed men. These Norse mercenaries wear heavy shirts of interlocking iron rings called chainmail. Blacksmiths forge thousands of individual iron rings and link them together to create a flexible, protective mesh to deflect sword strikes. The men wear iron conical helmets featuring vertical metal strips protecting their noses. They carry iron broadaxes with 30-inch ash wood handles. The mercenary fleets navigate into Dublin Bay in the middle of April in the year 1014. The men pull their shallow draft ships onto the sandy beaches and set up temporary camps on the eastern shoreline. High King Brian Boru gathers his Dal Cas army in the southern province of Munster. He commands thousands of men wearing dyed wool tunics and carrying round wooden shields covered in cured cowhide. The Munster army marches north along the dirt roads toward the coastal city of Dublin. They arrive on a flat, grassy plain known as Clontarf, located directly north of the River Tolka. The date is April 23, 1014. The Christian calendar marks this specific Friday as Good Friday. The air temperature sits at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind blows in from the saltwater bay. The morning tide pulls the ocean water away from the gravel beach, exposing flat stretches of wet sand. The Norse mercenaries and the Leinster rebels march out of the Dublin city gates. They cross the River Tolka and form a horizontal line of men stretching across the fields of Clontarf. The Dal Cas army forms an opposing line measuring exactly 1 mile in length. The soldiers pack tightly together, overlapping the edges of their circular wooden shields to create a continuous physical barrier. Brian Boru stands exactly 73 years old on the morning of the battle. He walks to a command tent pitched on a small hill behind the Munster infantry line. His eldest son, a 40-year-old warrior named Murchad, assumes direct physical command of the Dal Case warriors on the field. The two opposing armies march forward and collide on the wet grass. Men thrust iron-tipped spears over the tops of the wooden shields, targeting the exposed faces and throats of their enemies. The Norse mercenaries swing their heavy iron broadaxes, cleaving through the ash-wood shields and the human collarbones of the Munster soldiers. The battle continues for precisely 10 hours. The thousands of marching feet trample the green grass into thick brown mud. The warm blood of the fallen men mixes with the cold, wet soil. Men slip on the bloody mud and fall under the trampling boots of the advancing lines. Murchad grips a heavy iron sword with both hands, striking down enemy soldiers until the intense physical friction blisters his hands and causes his sword hilt to break. By the late afternoon, the Dal Case infantry pushes the Norse and Leinster forces backward toward the ocean. The returning evening tide floods the beach with cold sea water. The rising ocean water covers the wet sand and physically blocks the Norse mercenaries from reaching their grounded longships. The Dal Case warriors trap the retreating men against the deep water of the bay. Hundreds of heavily armored Norsemen step into the ocean to escape the spears. They drown in the salt water as the heavy weight of their iron chainmail pulls them directly to the sandy bottom. The surviving Leinster rebels drop their weapons and run toward the wooden bridges crossing the River Tolka. The Dal Case guards stationed at the bridges intercept the fleeing men and kill them with iron swords. The High King's forces kill an estimated 6,000 opposing soldiers, securing a complete military victory over the Norse-Gaelic alliance. The Viking commander Brodir flees the collapsing defensive line at the beach. He runs into the surrounding dense forest to escape the pursuing Munster soldiers. Brodir discovers the command tent of Brian Boru, pitched on the hillside. Brian kneels on a linen cushion inside the tent, holding a wooden cross in his hands. Two armed guards stand outside the canvas entrance, holding spears. Brodir and two retreating mercenaries strike the guards down with their iron axes. Brodir steps inside the tent and swings his heavy broadaxe downward. The iron blade strikes Brian Boru directly on the head, cleaving his skull and killing the 73-year-old monarch instantly. Masons lift a heavy limestone slab and bury the High King directly beneath the stone floor of the church. The sudden physical deaths of the High King and his eldest son Murchad remove the established ruling family from power. The remaining provincial kings mobilize their own regional armies and sharpen their weapons to claim the vacant throne. Following the physical death of Brian Boru in the year 1014, the central political authority on the island divides into isolated regional factions. The simultaneous deaths of Brian and his eldest son remove the established ruling heirs from the Dal Case family. Regional kings in the provinces of Munster, Connacht, and Ulster immediately mobilize their own military forces to claim the empty throne. They command men wearing knee-length linen tunics and carrying 30-inch iron swords to march across the territorial borders. The kings burn the thatched roofs of rival ring forts and drive stolen brown cattle back to their own enclosures. This continuous dynastic warfare lasts for exactly 150 years. Monks sitting in the rural scriptoriums record these localized military campaigns onto vellum pages. The scribes dip their shaved goose feather quills into black iron gall ink. They compile a chronological written record known as the Annals of Ireland. The scribes write a specific legal classification for the regional monarchs struggling to force submission from neighboring provinces. They write the Old Irish phrase, Rico Fresabra. This specific phrase translates to a high king with opposition. The scribes write this title next to the names of rulers who extract physical tribute from some provinces, while actively fighting others in open combat. In the year 1106, a man named Tordelbach Ua Conchober assumes the kingship of the western province of Connacht. Tordelbach rules from an earthen ring fort surrounded by the limestone plains and deep lakes of the west. He introduces new physical infrastructure to project his military force across the island. In the 1120s, Tordelbach orders laborers to construct stone castles to secure his territorial borders. Prior to this, the Gaelic kings relied entirely on earthen banks and wooden palisades for defense. Masons extract flat limestone blocks from the ground using heavy iron pickaxes with ashwood handles. They heat crushed limestone inside clay kilns, reaching temperatures of 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit to produce quicklime. They mix the white quicklime powder with river water and coarse sand to create wet mortar. The builders stack the limestone blocks and spread the mortar between the joints to build tall, rigid stone keeps. Tordelbach stations armed guards inside these stone structures to block rival armies from entering Connacht. He also commands local carpenters to build permanent wooden bridges across the fast-moving water of the River Shannon. The carpenters drive thick oak piles deep into the muddy riverbed using heavy wooden mallets. They lay flat timber planks across the vertical piles, creating a continuous wooden surface spanning the water. This physical infrastructure allows Tordelbach to march his infantry across the river in a matter of hours, bypassing the shallow fords entirely. Tordelbach constructs massive naval fleets to control the inland lakes and the western coastline. Shipwrights chop mature oak trees and build shallow draft wooden ships using overlapping planks and forged iron rivets. In the year 1124, Tordelbach orders hundreds of men to dig an artificial canal in modern-day County Galway. The labourers use flat iron shovels with wooden handles to dig through the dark, wet peat and heavy clay. They excavate a trench measuring exactly 1/2 mile in length, connecting the freshwater of Lough Corrib directly to the saltwater of the Atlantic Ocean. The ocean water floods the newly dug trench. The Connacht rowers pull their wooden ships through this artificial channel, bypassing the unnavigable rapids of the local river. Tordelbach loads armed men onto these ships and launches amphibious raids into the southern province of Munster. He forces the southern kings to hand over their male children as hostages. He physically splits the Munster province into 2 separate administrative halves. He assigns the southern half to the MacCarty family and the northern half to the Ua Brian family. This specific geographic division reduces the cattle wealth and military capacity of both families, securing Connacht's political dominance over the southern territories. Tordelbach Ua Conchober dies in the year 1156. His son, Ruadri Ua Conchober, inherits the kingship of Connacht and the command of the regional army. Ruadri marches his forces east, across the wooden bridges spanning the River Shannon. He extracts tribute payments of cattle and silver from the kingdoms of Meath and Munster. In the year 1166, Ruadri travels to the eastern coastline and enters the Norse Gaelic city of Dublin. The citizens of Dublin present Ruadri with 50 human hostages and pay him a stipend of 4,000 minted silver pennies. The local silversmiths strike these flat silver coins on iron dies using heavy metal hammers to imprint the local king's profile. Later that same year, Ruadri hosts a massive political assembly at the town of Athlone. The regional kings travel from the northern and southern provinces to attend the gathering in the center of the island. The rulers hand-tethered cattle to Ruadhri and formally submit to his political authority. The regional brehons record this physical transfer of wealth onto their vellum documents, formally recognizing Ruadhri Ua Conchobar as the undisputed High King of Ireland. Ruadhri utilizes the combined military forces of these submitted provinces to consolidate his supreme authority. He targets specific regional kings who refuse to accept his legal judgments. He focuses his attention on the eastern province of Leinster. A man named Diarmait mac Mercada rules the Leinster territory from a stone and timber settlement in modern-day County Wexford. Diarmait previously allied himself with a rival northern king, placing himself in direct military opposition to the new High King. Ruadhri gathers thousands of armed men from Connacht, Meath and Dublin. He marches this massive infantry column eastward across the dirt roads, moving directly toward the borders of Leinster to depose the provincial monarch. High King Ruadhri Ua Conchobar marches his combined infantry forces east into the province of Leinster in the autumn of 1166. He commands thousands of soldiers gathered from the territories of Connacht, Meath and Dublin. The men walk across the dirt roads carrying iron-tipped ash spears and round wooden shields. They target the ruling provincial monarch of Leinster, a man named Diarmait mac Mercada. Diarmait controls the eastern agricultural valleys and rules from a stone and timber ring fort at a settlement called Ferns in modern-day County Wexford. Ruadhri's men arrive at Ferns and burn the thatched roofs of the circular houses using torches made of pine pitch and dry straw. The invading soldiers seize Diarmait's brown cattle herds and drive the animals back toward the central plains. Ruadhri formally deposes Diarmait from his kingship and banishes him from the island of Hibernia. On August 1st, 1166, Diarmait boards a wooden merchant ship at the eastern port of Wexford. The ship measures exactly 40 feet in length and features a hull built from overlapping oak planks. The crew hoists a single square woven wool sail up a central pine mast. The ship navigates across the choppy salt water of the Irish Sea to the port city of Bristol in England. Bristol operates as a major trading hub on the banks of the River Avon. Merchants stand on the wooden docks, unloading heavy wooden barrels of French wine and raw iron ingots from the cargo holds of docked vessels. Diarmait stays in Bristol for several weeks before securing passage on another wooden ship, sailing south toward the European continent. He travels to the region of Aquitaine in modern-day France to locate the Anglo-Norman King of England, Henry II. King Henry holds physical court in Aquitaine, managing his expansive territorial empire stretching from the Scottish border down to the Pyrenees Mountains. Diarmait locates King Henry in the winter months of early 1167. The air temperature sits at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone halls of the Aquitaine castle smell of burning oak logs and roasting pork. Diarmait stands before King Henry on the flat stone floor. He drops to his knees and places his bare hands directly between the hands of the English monarch. This specific physical gesture constitutes a formal oath of fealty under the Norman feudal system. Diarmait pledges his total loyalty to King Henry in exchange for military assistance to reclaim his lost territory in Leinster. King Henry accepts the physical oath and dictates a formal royal letter to his court scribes. The scribes work in a dedicated room lit by beeswax candles. They manufacture a writing surface by soaking a sheepskin in quicklime and scraping the animal hair away with an iron blade. They stretch the wet skin over a wooden frame to dry, creating a flat piece of parchment. The scribes write the letter in Latin onto this parchment using a sharpened goose feather quill. They dip the quill into black ink made from boiled oak galls and iron sulfate. Henry presses his metal signet ring into a pool of hot red wax poured onto the bottom margin of the parchment. The ring leaves a permanent physical impression of the royal seal in the hardened wax. This specific document, known as letters patent, grants Diarmait the legal authority to recruit mercenary soldiers from among King Henry's subjects. Diarmait carries this sealed parchment back across the English Channel and travels directly to the borderlands of Wales. The Norman lords occupying Wales live in square stone keep castles built along the steep river valleys. These specific lords maintain private armies of heavily armed knights riding trained war horses. Diarmait presents the royal letter to a prominent Norman nobleman named Richard de Clare. Richard holds the formal title of the Earl of Pembroke and carries the common nickname Strongbow. Strongbow owes massive financial debts to Jewish moneylenders living in England and to King Henry's royal treasury. Diarmait negotiates a specific military contract with the indebted Earl inside a stone castle in Wales. Diarmait requires a fully equipped Norman army to cross the Irish Sea and fight the High King's forces. In exchange for this army, Diarmait promises to give his eldest daughter Aoife to Strongbow in marriage. According to the native Gaelic Brehon law, women do not inherit land or political titles. Under the Norman feudal law practiced by Strongbow, a husband legally claims the territorial holdings of his wife's family upon marriage. Diarmait explicitly promises Strongbow the legal succession rights to the entire Kingdom of Leinster upon his own physical death. Strongbow accepts these terms and begins assembling a mercenary force from his tenant farmers and vassal knights in Pembrokeshire. Diarmait secures additional military support from other Norman lords in Wales, including Maurice Fitzgerald and Robert Fitzstephen. He promises these men large tracts of fertile agricultural land near the coastal town of Wexford. Diarmait leaves Wales and sails back to the eastern coast of Leinster in the autumn of 1167. He travels with a small vanguard force of Flemish and Norman mercenaries, wearing heavy leather armor. He hides inside the Augustinian stone monastery he previously constructed in his home settlement of Ferns. He waits there for exactly 18 months, while Strongbow gathers the main invasion fleet across the water. In the Welsh coastal ports, Norman blacksmiths work continuously over charcoal forges, reaching temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. They forge hundreds of iron horseshoes. They hammer thousands of small iron rivets to assemble chainmail shirts known as hauberks. Each completed iron shirt weighs 30 pounds. Fletchers carve wooden arrow shafts from ash branches and attach iron bodkin points designed specifically to pierce leather armor. Craftsmen build wooden crossbows featuring steel prods and trigger mechanisms to shoot short iron-tipped bolts. Carpenters load heavy oak planks onto the transport ships to build temporary standing stalls for the destriers. These heavy war horses weigh up to 1,200 pounds each. The logistics officers stockpile salted pork, hard wheat biscuits, and wooden barrels of fresh river water in the cargo holds for the ocean crossing. The mercenary force finalizes their military preparations and boards the wooden transport ships on the coast of Wales in the early spring of 1169. On the first day of May in the year 1169, 3 wooden transport ships drop iron anchors in the shallow waters of Bannow Bay. The bay sits on the southern coast of modern-day County Wexford. The air temperature measures exactly 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind carries the smell of wet sand and salt. Robert Fitzstephen commands the ships. 30 Norman knights walk down the wooden gangplanks onto the gravel beach. 60 men-at-arms follow them. 300 Welsh archers disembark, carrying longbows carved from yew branches. The Norman knights wear heavy armor. Blacksmiths forge thousands of individual iron rings and interlock them to create chainmail shirts called hauberks. Each hauberk weighs exactly 30 pounds and covers the knight from the shoulders down to the knees. The knights wear conical iron helmets, featuring vertical metal strips covering their noses. They lead heavily muscled war horses down the wooden ramps. These destrier horses weigh up to 1,200 pounds each. The grooms attach iron horseshoes to the animal's hooves using square metal nails. Diarmait Mac Murchada meets this mercenary force on the beach. He guides them east toward the Norse Gaelic city of Wexford. The local Gaelic defenders wear knee-length linen tunics and carry iron-tipped spears. The Norman knights mount their war horses. They place their leather boots into iron stirrups. The stirrups provide a solid physical platform, allowing the rider to transfer the full momentum of the galloping horse directly into his weapon. The knights lower 12-foot wooden lances tipped with forged steel points. They tuck the heavy wooden shafts tightly under their right armpits. They spur their horses forward. The heavy cavalry charge slams into the linen-clad Gaelic infantry. The physical weight and speed of the war horses knock the defenders to the ground. The steel lance points pierce the unarmored chests of the Gaelic men. The Welsh archers draw linen bowstrings back to their ears and release iron bodkin arrows into the scattered infantry. The arrows puncture the hardened cowhide shields. In August of the year 1170, Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, arrives on the southern coast. He sails a fleet of transport ships into the estuary near the Norse Gaelic city of Waterford. He unloads a force of 200 knights and 1,000 archers. They march directly to the stone defensive walls of Waterford. The Norman soldiers locate a wooden house built directly into the exterior stone wall of the city. They use iron axes to chop through the wooden support posts of the house. The wooden structure collapses into the dirt, pulling a section of the stone wall down with it. The Norman knights run through the resulting gap in the rubble. They strike the local defenders with double-edged iron swords and capture the city. Following the capture of Waterford, Diarmait Mac Murchada travels into the city holding the hand of his eldest daughter, Aoife. Strongbow and Aoife stand together inside the Christ Church Cathedral of Waterford. The stone walls of the cathedral stand cold and damp. The interior air smells of burning beeswax candles and incense smoke. A priest, wearing white linen vestments, speaks Latin words to officiate the ceremony. Strongbow places a gold ring on Aoife's finger. This physical marriage ceremony secures Strongbow's legal claim to inherit the Kingdom of Leinster under Norman feudal law. In September of the year 1170, Strongbow and Diarmait march their combined armies north toward the city of Dublin. They walk through the granite valleys of the Wicklow Mountains to bypass the main roads. They arrive outside the earthen banks and timber walls of Dublin. The Norse Gaelic king of Dublin, Hasculf, initiates peace negotiations. While the leaders speak, a group of Norman knights scales the timber walls and breaches the wooden gates. The knights kill the guards using iron broadaxes. Hasculf runs to the River Liffey, boards a wooden longship, and sails away across the Irish Sea. Diarmait Mac Murchada dies at his settlement in Ferns in May of the year 1171. Local scribes record his physical death in their vellum manuscripts using iron gall ink. Upon Diarmait's death, Strongbow formally claims the title of King of Leinster, based entirely on his marriage to Aoife. High King Ruadhrí Ua Conchobar mobilizes a massive army to physically contest this transfer of power. The High King gathers 30,000 armed men from the western and northern provinces. Ruadhrí marches this massive infantry column to the fields outside Dublin during the summer months of 1171. The air temperature sits at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The Gaelic army sets up a blockade around the city perimeters, physically preventing carts of wheat grain and salted beef from entering the wooden gates. Strongbow and his Norman knights remain trapped behind the timber walls for 2 entire months. They eat their stored provisions and watch their war horses lose body weight from the lack of fresh grass. In early September, Strongbow organizes a sudden military sortie. 600 armored Norman knights mount their remaining war horses. They ride out of the city gates in 3 distinct columns. They ride directly into the High King's unfortified camp at Castleknock. The High King's soldiers sit on the grass, eating roasted meat and bathing in the river Liffey when the cavalry arrives. The Norman knights drive their steel lances into the unprotected backs of the Gaelic infantry. The heavy war horses trample the campfires and the canvas tents. High King Ruadhrí escapes the camp by mounting a horse and riding rapidly to the west. The Norman victory at Castleknock breaks the massive siege of Dublin. Strongbow consolidates his physical control over the entire eastern seaboard. News of Strongbow's independent military victories reaches King Henry II in England. King Henry observes his vassal acquiring massive tracts of territory and operating an autonomous army. The English monarch issues orders to his logistics officers to assemble a massive royal armada. He prepares to transport his own royal army across the Irish Sea to force the submission of the independent Norman barons. On October 17, 1171, King Henry II sails across the Irish Sea. He commands a fleet of exactly 400 wooden transport ships. The ships carry 4,000 armed men and 500 heavy war horses. The fleet drops iron anchors in the harbour of Waterford on the southern coast of the island. The air temperature sits at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind smells of salt and wet canvas. King Henry steps off his wooden ship onto the gravel beach. He arrives to establish direct physical control over the autonomous Norman barons currently occupying the Eastern Territories. Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, travels to Waterford. Strongbow kneels in the mud before the English monarch. He hands the forged iron keys of the coastal cities of Dublin, Waterford, and Wexford directly to King Henry. King Henry marches his army north to Dublin in the winter of 1171. His carpenters construct a temporary royal palace using peeled willow poles and woven hazel branches. King Henry hosts a council inside this wooden structure. He claims the conquered territories as a direct dependency of the English crown. Scribes write the Latin title Dominium Hiberniae onto parchment documents using iron gall ink. This phrase translates directly to the Lordship of Ireland. In 1172, King Henry organizes a religious assembly at the Rock of Cashel. The church leaders call this meeting the Synod of Cashel. The assembled bishops decree that the Irish Church must conform precisely to the practices of the Catholic Church in England. They mandate the collection of tithes, requiring farmers to give exactly 1/10 of their grain harvest to the local parish church. King Henry divides the eastern agricultural plains into distinct geographic counties. He appoints Norman barons to govern these newly drawn boundaries. The barons enforce English common law across the territory. This legal system replaces the localized Brehon law inside the conquered zones. The English system mandates that property passes exclusively to the eldest son through a legal mechanism called primogeniture. The royal administrators establish a permanent court of justice inside the wooden walls of Dublin. Judges wearing heavy woolen robes sit on wooden benches. They order the execution of convicted criminals by hanging them from ropes tied to oak tree branches. The administrators also establish the Court of Exchequer to manage royal taxation. Clerks sit at large wooden tables covered with checkered wool cloths. They place metal coins onto the woven squares to calculate the specific tax debts of the Norman lords. Tax collectors transport heavy wooden chests filled with these silver pennies directly to the royal treasury in London. The English administration imposes the manorial agricultural system onto the landscape. The Norman lords divide the land into large open fields. Peasant labourers plough the soil using heavy wooden ploughs fitted with iron mouldboards. Oxen pull the ploughs, turning over deep furrows of earth. The farmers plant winter wheat in the autumn and harvest it the following summer with iron sickles. Merchants load sacks of this harvested wheat onto wooden ships at the port of Dublin and transport the grain across the sea to feed the armies of the English king. The Norman barons secure their physical control over these agricultural estates by constructing motte and bailey castles. Labourers use iron shovels to dig deep circular ditches into the topsoil. They pile the excavated dirt into a steep, cone-shaped mound called a motte. They pack the dirt tightly to create a flat summit, measuring 30 feet in diameter. Carpenters build a square wooden keep on top of this elevated motte, using cut oak beams. They drive sharpened timber stakes into the ground around the base of the mound to form a wide, enclosed courtyard called a bailey. The barons stable their heavy war horses and store their wheat grain inside this protected wooden bailey. Hugh de Lacy, a prominent Norman lord, builds a massive stone fortress called Trim Castle on the southern bank of the River Boyne. Masons extract flat limestone blocks from local quarries. They mix quicklime and river water to create mortar. They build a 3-story stone keep, featuring walls measuring 11 feet thick. The thick stone walls physically block incoming iron arrows and resist the impact of heavy wooden battering rams. The continuous construction of these castles forces the native Gaelic families to move away from the fertile eastern plains. The Gaelic lords walk westward, driving their herds of brown cattle into the limestone mountains of Connacht and the wet peat bogs of the Midlands. The Norman knights halt their heavy war horses at the edges of the deep mud. The heavy hooves of the destriers sink into the waterlogged peat, trapping the animals in the wetlands. The Gaelic warriors maintain control of these western and central territories. They fight the Norman border patrols using short ashwood bows and iron javelins. They throw the javelins across the muddy bogs, piercing the chainmail armor of the dismounted knights. Over the next 2 centuries, the geographic area controlled directly by the English crown shrinks. The administration in Dublin maintains only enough military troops to garrison a narrow strip of land surrounding the city. Administrators call this fortified zone the Pale. The Pale measures approximately 20 miles wide and 30 miles long. Labourers dig a continuous defensive ditch along the exact perimeter of the Pale. They pile the dirt to create a raised bank and plant dense hawthorn bushes on top. The sharp wooden thorns of the hawthorn bushes physically block cattle and armed men from crossing the boundary. The English common law applies exclusively within the borders of this specific earthen bank. Outside the Pale, the descendants of the original Norman invaders integrate into the surrounding society. They arrange formal marriage contracts with the daughters of neighbouring Gaelic kings. They adopt the spoken Gaelic language and employ brehons to settle their property disputes. The Gaelic leaders living in the western bogs and mountains observe the retreating English administration. In the year 1348, a biological disease arrives on merchant ships docking in the eastern ports, killing thousands of urban residents and clearing the physical path for the rural Gaelic lords to reclaim their lost territories. In August of 1348, wooden merchant ships dock at the eastern ports of Dublin and Drogheda. The ships arrive from the port of Bristol carrying wooden barrels of wine and raw iron ingots. Black rats live in the dark, damp cargo holds of these vessels. Fleas live directly on the skin of the rats. The fleas carry a specific biological bacterium called Yersinia pestis. The ship crews tie thick hemp ropes to the wooden docks. The rats run down the ropes onto the land. The fleas bite the human inhabitants living tightly packed inside the wattle and daub houses of the Norman cities. The bacterium enters the human bloodstream and multiplies. The infected humans develop black, swollen lymph nodes on their necks and groins. The air inside the walled cities sits at 60 degrees Fahrenheit and smells of decaying human flesh and wood smoke. Gravediggers use iron shovels to excavate large rectangular pits in the dirt outside the city walls. They place hundreds of dead bodies directly into these mass graves and cover them with quicklime and heavy soil. The disease kills an estimated 40% of the urban population living along the eastern seaboard. The native Gaelic population lives in dispersed agricultural settlements across the western and northern provinces. Families live inside isolated earthen ring forts separated by miles of open pasture and wet peat bog. This physical distance between households stops the infected fleas from spreading the bacterium to the rural Gaelic inhabitants. The Gaelic lords observe the sudden drop in Norman military personnel occupying the border castles. They gather their own armed infantrymen. They hire heavy infantry mercenaries from the western islands of Scotland. The Gaels call these mercenaries gallowglass. The gallowglass wear heavy iron chainmail shirts over padded linen jackets. They carry two-handed iron sparth axes measuring 5 feet in length. In the early 1400s, these Gaelic lords march eastward out of the mountains. They attack the understaffed Norman stone keeps. The gallowglass warriors swing their heavy iron axes directly into the wooden castle doors, splintering the oak planks. The warriors climb the stone stairs and strike the remaining Norman guards with iron swords. The O'Neill family re-establishes direct physical control over the northern province of Ulster. The McCarthy family reclaims massive tracts of grazing land in the southern province of Munster. The Gaelic lords force the surviving Norman farmers living near the Pale to pay an annual physical tax of silver coins and cattle to avoid continuous attacks. The English administrators refer to this specific tax as black rent. The surviving Norman families living beyond the physical boundaries of the Pale adapt to the surrounding environment to maintain their land. Families like the Fitzgeralds in Munster and the Burkes in Connacht interact daily with their Gaelic neighbours. The Burkes change their family name from the original Norman French name, de Burgh. They arrange formal marriage contracts with the daughters of the local Gaelic kings. The Norman lords participate in the Gaelic system of fosterage. They send their biological sons to live inside the earthen ring forts of allied Gaelic families. The children grow up speaking the Gaelic language and learning customary Brehon law. The Norman lords discard their heavy chainmail armour for daily wear. They adopt native styles of dress. They wear the lane, a knee-length yellow linen tunic dyed with crushed saffron crocus flowers. They wrap thick woolen mantles around their shoulders to block the cold rain. They employ native brehons to calculate exact cattle payments for property disputes. The brehons recite the legal judgments orally from memory. Scribes sitting in Dublin write the term Old English onto parchment documents to classify these assimilated families. The blending of bloodlines and daily habits creates a unified political bloc operating independently of the English crown. The English administrators sitting in Dublin attempt to halt this cultural assimilation through written legislation. In February of 1366, the king's representative, Lionel of Antwerp, hosts a parliament inside the stone halls of Kilkenny Castle. The gathered officials dictate a series of specific laws to their scribes. The scribes write 35 distinct clauses onto calfskin parchment using iron gall ink. The document carries the title, The Statutes of Kilkenny. The written laws mandate that all subjects of the English crown must speak the English language and utilize English naming conventions. The text details a specific financial penalty for any Norman lord marrying a Gaelic woman or participating in the fosterage of children. The statutes require men to ride horses using wooden saddles and iron stirrups. The text establishes a fine for the native Gaelic practice of riding horses bareback. The written laws dictate the removal of Old English lords who host Gaelic poets, travelling musicians, and storytellers inside their stone castles. The Parliament also outlaws the native game of hurling. The text demands men practice archery with yew bows and iron-tipped arrows, setting a penalty for hitting a leather ball with curved ash-wood sticks on the grassy fields. Lionel of Antwerp presses his royal metal seal into hot red wax at the bottom of the parchment to enact the legislation. The English administration copies these statutes and sends them by horseback to the regional barons. The Crown possesses a standing army of only 300 archers and men-at-arms stationed in Dublin. This small military force remains physically confined behind the hawthorn hedges of the Pale. The Old English lords ignore the parchment decrees completely. They continue to breed cattle, speak Gaelic, and marry into the native dynasties. The English monarchs spend the next 150 years fighting wars in France and battling rival political factions within their own borders in England. They leave the Gaelic and Old English lords to rule the island independently. In the early 1500s, a new ruling family takes control of the English throne. This specific family shifts its attention back across the Irish Sea, preparing to upgrade their legal titles and confiscate the fertile agricultural land to plant loyal Protestant settlers. On June 18, 1542, King Henry VIII dictates a new legal document inside the Palace of Westminster in London. Scribes copy the dictated words into Latin onto a large sheet of calfskin parchment using iron gall ink. This document carries the formal title of the Crown of Ireland Act. The written text officially upgrades the historical lordship of Ireland into the Kingdom of Ireland. King Henry sends messengers carrying copies of this parchment across the Irish Sea. The messengers deliver a specific royal demand to the native Gaelic lords ruling the provinces. The English monarch requires all Gaelic chieftains to physically surrender their ancestral lands directly to the crown. The Gaelic lords travel to the royal courts in Dublin and London to comply with the decree. The men stand on the flat stone floors of the courtrooms. They hand a clump of dark soil and a broken wooden twig to the king's representatives. This physical transfer of soil and wood symbolizes the complete surrender of their territories. The royal clerks immediately hand the lords a new sealed parchment document. These documents re-grant the exact same agricultural land back to the lords under formal English titles. A traditional Gaelic king becomes an English earl or a baron. The legal system governing the property changes immediately. The royal courts apply English common law to the estates. Inheritance shifts to primogeniture, a legal mechanism passing the land exclusively to the eldest biological son. The lords agree to speak the English language and wear English wool doublets fastened with brass buttons to maintain their new titles. The English administration uses this new legal framework to confiscate millions of acres of agricultural land from families who refuse the royal agreements. Royal surveyors arrive in the southern and Midland provinces. They carry iron measuring chains called Gunter's chains. Each metal chain measures exactly 66 feet in length and consists of 100 individual iron links. The surveyors drag the heavy iron chains across the wet grass to calculate the exact acreage of the confiscated properties. Cartographers draw precise physical boundary lines onto paper maps using graphite pencils. The Crown grants these measured parcels of land to Protestant settlers imported from England and Scotland. The settlers arrive on wooden ships carrying printed paper Bibles. They dismantle the ancient circular earthen ring forts using iron pickaxes. They build rectangular stone houses featuring slate tile roofs and clear glass windows. They plant rows of apple trees in the dark soil. They enclose their new grazing pastures with straight limestone walls. In the northern province of Ulster, a Gaelic lord named Hugh O'Neill holds the newly created English title of the Earl of Tyrone. O'Neill observes the English administrators surveying the neighbouring territories. In 1593, O'Neill gathers the remaining Gaelic lords inside the dense oak forests of Ulster. He organizes a military confederacy to halt the English expansion into the northern province. O'Neill uses his accumulated cattle wealth to purchase modern military equipment from Scottish merchants. He buys matchlock muskets featuring smoothbore iron barrels and carved walnut stocks. He trains his Gaelic infantrymen to operate the firearms. The men pour black gunpowder into the metal firing pans of the muskets. The gunpowder consists of crushed saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. The men cast spherical lead bullets using heated iron molds and drop the heavy lead balls down the iron barrels. They push the bullets into the gunpowder using wooden ramrods. O'Neill imports thousands of these weapons and trains a standing army to march in synchronized geometric formations. O'Neill dictates letters in Latin to his scribes. Messengers carry these folded paper letters onto merchant ships sailing south to the Iberian Peninsula. The letters request direct military assistance from King Philip III of Spain. King Philip dispatches a fleet of 33 wooden galleons from the Spanish port of A Coruña. The ships carry 3,000 armed Spanish infantrymen. The Spanish soldiers wear steel breastplates and carry 14-foot ashwood pikes. The fleet sails north through the rough waters of the Atlantic Ocean, smelling of salted cod, wet canvas, and bilge water. On September 21st, 1601, the Spanish fleet drops iron anchors at the port town of Kinsale in modern-day County Cork. The Spanish soldiers march down the wooden gangplanks and occupy the stone houses of the coastal town. The English Lord Deputy, Charles Blount, marches an army of 12,000 men south to confront the invasion. The English soldiers dig deep siege trenches into the wet mud surrounding the town, using broad iron shovels. They position heavy bronze cannons on elevated wooden platforms. Artillerymen load cast-iron cannonballs weighing 30 pounds into the bronze barrels. They light the fuses with slow-burning match cords. The gunpowder explodes, sending the solid iron balls smashing directly into the limestone walls of Kinsale. Hugh O'Neill marches his Ulster army 300 miles south to relieve the trapped Spanish forces. The men walk through freezing rain and snow during the winter months. The air temperature drops to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. On December 24, 1601, O'Neill's forces arrive outside the English siege lines at Kinsale. The ground consists of waterlogged peat and slippery mud. The English cavalry mounts their heavy war horses. The riders wear articulated steel armor, covering their chests and arms. They charge across the wet fields holding heavy steel lances. The English war horses crash directly into the Gaelic infantry lines. The Gaelic soldiers break their formations, drop their heavy iron pikes, and run across the muddy fields. The English soldiers capture the retreating men and execute them on the grass with iron swords. The Spanish commander surrenders the town of Kinsale to the English generals. The Spanish soldiers board their wooden galleons and sail back to Spain. Hugh O'Neill marches his surviving men back to the northern province of Ulster. The English military secures physical control over the entire island. The royal administrators sitting in Dublin pass new written laws confiscating the massive agricultural estates of the defeated Ulster lords. Hugh O'Neill sits inside his stone castle in County Tyrone. English sheriffs deliver written summons requiring O'Neill to appear in the Dublin courts to face charges of treason. The mounting legal and financial pressure forces O'Neill and his remaining allies to pack their physical belongings in wooden chests and look toward the coastal ports for a permanent escape route. Hugh O'Neill lives inside a stone castle at Dungannon in modern-day County Tyrone. The year is 1607. English administrators operating out of Dublin send royal sheriffs to the castle. The sheriffs ride horses over the dirt roads. They hand O'Neill paper documents, folded and sealed with red wax. The written text orders O'Neill to travel to London to face legal charges in the royal courts. O'Neill reads the Latin text. He commands his servants to pack his physical belongings into wooden chests. He arranges a departure from the island. O'Neill sends a messenger carrying silver coins to the coastal port of Rathmullen in modern-day County Donegal. The messenger hires a French merchant ship anchored in Lough Swilly. Shipwrights built this specific vessel to carry exactly 80 tons of cargo. The hull consists of overlapping oak planks secured with iron rivets. The crew coated the exterior wood with heated pine pitch to waterproof the timber. O'Neill and his ally, Rory O'Donnell, gather their extended families. They pack heavy wooden chests with gold coins, silver drinking chalices, and woolen clothing. They lift these chests onto wooden carts, drawn by native draft horses. They march across the wet peat bogs of the northern province. They arrive on the gravel beach of Rathmullen on September 14, 1607. The water of Lough Swilly measures exactly 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind blows from the north, carrying the scent of salt spray and wet sand. 90 people walk up a wooden gangplank and board the French ship. The group includes the earls, their wives, their biological children, and armed retainers wearing leather coats. The French crew turns a heavy wooden capstan to pull the iron anchor out of the water. They untie thick hemp ropes to release the square woven linen sails. The wind pushes against the linen fabric. The ship travels north out of the deep saltwater inlet and enters the open Atlantic Ocean. The ship navigates south toward the European continent. The passengers spend 21 days on the water. They eat salted beef and drink fresh water from wooden barrels. The ship docks at a stone port in France. The earls and their retinues walk down the gangplank onto the docks. They travel across the continent riding mules and walking on foot. They cross the snow-covered passes of the Alps and arrive in the city of Rome in April of 1608. Pope Paul V provides them with stone houses in Rome and a monthly stipend of minted silver coins. Back in Dublin, the English Lord Deputy, Arthur Chichester, sits at a wooden desk. He dips a shaved goose feather quill into iron gall ink. He signs parchment documents declaring O'Neill and O'Donnell guilty of treason. The royal courts confiscate the physical estates of the exiled earls. This legal action transfers exactly 500,000 acres of agricultural land in the province of Ulster directly to the English monarch, King James I. King James initiates a colonization project known as the Plantation of Ulster. He dictates instructions to grant the confiscated land to Protestant settlers from Scotland and England. English surveyors travel to the northern province to map the newly acquired territory. They carry heavy Gunter's chains made of 100 individual iron links. They stretch the 66-foot chains across the wet grass to measure the precise acreage. Cartographers draw grid lines and property boundaries onto paper maps using graphite pencils. Thousands of Scottish and English settlers cross the Irish Sea on wooden transport ships. They land on the northern beaches carrying heavy iron axes and flat iron shovels. The settlers walk inland and cut down the native oak forests. They hire masons to build rectangular stone houses. The masons cut square sandstone blocks using iron chisels. They mix quicklime and river sand to create wet mortar. They build straight exterior walls and install clear glass windows. They cover the steep wooden roofs with flat slate tiles. They surround these stone houses with high defensive walls called bournes, stacking mortared stones to a height of 12 feet. King James assigns a specific portion of the confiscated land to the merchant guilds of London. The guilds finance the construction of a massive fortified settlement on the western bank of the River Foyle named Londonderry. Masons extract flat grey schist rocks from local quarries. They build a continuous defensive stone wall enclosing the entire town. The wall measures exactly 24 feet in height and 30 feet in width. Artillerymen position heavy cast iron cannons on the wide tops of the stone walls. The settlers establish new market towns across the province. They lay out straight dirt streets, intersecting at exact right angles. They designate a central square in the middle of each town to host a weekly agricultural market. They build stone courthouses and Protestant stone churches in these central squares. The new inhabitants alter the agricultural practices of the region. They enclose the open grazing pastures with straight wooden fences. They import distinct breeds of English sheep featuring thick wool. They plough the dark soil using heavy wooden ploughs fitted with iron moldboards. They plant massive fields of flax. Women harvest the mature flax stalks and soak them in the river water to separate the fibers. They spin the flax fibers into linen thread using wooden spinning wheels. The English administrators enforce the English common law across the entire province. Judges wearing black wool robes and powdered white wigs sit on wooden benches inside the new stone courthouses. They dictate property rulings based entirely on written English statutes. Local sheriffs collect taxes in minted silver coins and deposit them into wooden chests bound with iron strips. Laborers demolish the remaining circular earthen ring forts. They construct straight stone walls, grid-patterned towns, and measured agricultural fields across the landscape to physically integrate the territory into the expanding British Empire.